Welcome back to Askewed Reviews. And this week I'm doing a theme week of I can't believe this is real, but it is. This is also a viewer request, and it's for the 1991 film Nothing But Trouble. Here is your trivia question for today. What music group makes a cameo in this film? The answer will be at the end of this episode. So, in the film Nothing But Trouble, a group of friends consisting of Chris, a financial publisher, Diane, a lawyer, and two of Chris's clients, Fausto and Ronalda, are all going on a road trip together. Now, after a bit of pestering from the siblings in the back seat, Chris agrees to take a bit of a detour so they can try to find an area to have a picnic. They end up driving through the rural town of Vulcanvania, where Chris unfortunately does not make a traffic stop and ends up getting followed by one of the local police. After a bit more pestering, this then turns into a high speed pursuit where eventually the chief of police does manage to catch them. They then have to follow him back to the Vulcanvania courthouse where they all must stand trial. The individual presiding over their case is the local justice of the peace, Alvin Vulcanheiser. Now, since the judge immediately feels like they're not respecting him, he decides to imprison them in the courthouse for the night, which also happens to be his home, and is full of tricks and traps. All of the other individuals living within this home are not just part of the police department, they also happen to be the grandchildren of the judge. So, will everyone be able to stay on their best behavior overnight and potentially earn their freedom tomorrow? Or will they end up angering the judge even more and earn a one-way ticket onto the execution roller coaster called the Bone Stripper? So, before going with the title Nothing But Trouble, some other options were called Vulcanvania, Git, Road to Ruin, and Trick House. Some of the potential directors for this film were John Hughes, John Landis, and Ivan Reitman, but all of them ended up turning it down. Now, since no other director was available, Dan Aykroyd, who was the writer and potentially some of the characters at the time, offered to do it even though he was not interested. This would end up being Dan Aykroyd's only time directing a film. The co-writer for this film was Dan's brother, Peter Aykroyd. Now, there ended up being a few things that inspired Aykroyd to create this story. One inspiration that was completely random is one day he just imagined what his friend John Candy would look like in drag and couldn't stop laughing about it, so he ended up thinking that he wanted to do a film at the very least where Candy was in drag for part of it. The primary inspiration for the story was a personal experience that Aykroyd had in 1978. He was pulled over for speeding in a rural town. The police officer took him to the local justice of the peace in the middle of the night for a trial. And then apparently the remaining inspiration was just some random weird dreams that Aykroyd had. As you're probably aware, Dan Aykroyd does play one of the main characters of The Judge. He does play one additional character as well, but I'll go over that in a bit. His original plan was actually to play the judge and Chris, but the studio said that they wanted Chevy Chase. Now, apparently, if Chase had turned down the role, some of the other actors that the studio were interested in were Rick Moranis and Jeff Goldblum. Diane Lightson is played by Demi Moore, but before she was brought on, John Candy originally suggested Meg Ryan. Speaking of John Candy, he plays both of the roles of Dennis and Eldona. Valerie Bromfield plays the character of Miss Purda, but this role was originally offered to Jane Curtin and Catherine O'Hara, but unfortunately both of them were unavailable. Now, rounding out the Vulcanheiser family, you have the brothers of Bobo and Little Devil. Bobo is actually the second character that Dan Aykroyd plays in this film. Now, imagine this. Aykroyd is apparently very busy taking on the directing, writing, and even performing in this. So some of the times that he's directing, he was in full makeup as Bobo or as the judge. Now, the character of Little Devil is played by an actor who only has two film credits, known as John Davicus. At one time, Aykroyd was potentially looking at actor Chris Farley to play one of these brothers. Taylor Negron and Bertilla Damas played the characters of Fausto and Ronalda, and apparently created most of their own dialogue. There's also a few cameos in this film from some well-known brothers. From the Murray brothers, you have Brian Doyle Murray. From the Baldwins, you have Daniel Baldwin. And in fact, the co-writer and brother of Dan Aykroyd, Peter Aykroyd, is Mike the Doorman. And finally, another actor you might recognize in this film is Raymond J. Barry. One more thing involving the actors on this film is apparently the crew loved working with both John Candy and Demi Moore, but hated working with Chevy Chase, which is not surprising as Chase is infamous for being a nightmare to work with. Unfortunately, one of the biggest things that doomed this film from the beginning is the fact that Dan Aykroyd went $5 million over budget because he kept adding more and more mechanical stuff to the set, and of course, all of the junk from the junkyard. Something that appears in this film is one of the first appearances of digital mapping. The ETAC system was the first digital map system that was introduced in 1985. It wasn't GPS, but it did store maps. Here's a random piece of trivia for you. All of the police badges that appear on the judge's wall are actually from Dan Aykroyd's collection. This movie was filmed in California, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. So when it comes to the film Nothing But Trouble, I do actually like this movie. Now, mind you, I don't think it's a great movie, but it is still very entertaining and pretty funny. I also like the fact that it feels like this to me is what Texas Chainsaw Massacre or House of a Thousand Corpses would be like if it was a comedy. So I'm going to give this movie a 3 out of 5. Now, if you like this film, other movies I recommend checking out are Haunted Honeymoon, The Rocky Horror Picture Show, Freaked, and The Addams Family. Now it's time to answer the trivia question from the beginning of this episode. What music group makes a cameo in this film? So they show up not just for a cameo, but actually to do a whole song during the film, and this is the music group Digital Underground, which, if you didn't know, at the time, Tupac Shakur was a member, and this is actually Tupac's feature film debut. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Askewed Reviews, and if you have a movie that you'd like to see get a review, just mention it in the comments, and especially if it is a movie that fits within this week's theme, because I'd love to do this again sometime.